We're really glad to have you. Susan and I have a couple here this morning that are special guests of ours. Michael and Melinda Wiest are traveling back from Oklahoma City to New Mexico. We knew Michael when he was a young man in Enid, and we have known them both through the years as we have traveled back and forth to Artesia, New Mexico, speaking in their church there and different things. And they had a daughter graduate from Lubbock Christian. And I just learned a moment ago that she's a distant relative of Ronita. But I don't want any of you to hold that against her, okay? I mean, Melinda's really a good girl, so We are continuing this morning to study about this subject of faith. And we're there because of our study of the book of Romans. And we have been looking in the book of Romans, and we have learned this wonderfully good, powerful news that though we have no righteousness in us, God is willing to cover us with His righteousness. He is so very gracious. He sent His Son so that we might have His righteousness covering us. But it comes by way of our faith. And so the entire 4th chapter of the book of Romans has been about faith. And we spent several weeks with it now. We have this week and one more talking about faith. And what I want to talk about this morning is the idea of how faith has to keep growing in our lives. Now this comment may surprise you, it may shock you, and it may not be totally accurate in the way you think. It even shocked me when I began to think it. To enter the kingdom of heaven, it takes only a tiny, maybe you call it infant, maybe you call it baby faith to enter the kingdom of heaven. It just takes a little baby type faith because you become convinced that in your sinful life, you have a very ugly future. And then you become totally convinced that God did send His Son, and by way of His Son, I can be covered with His blood, His righteousness, my sins can be gone. And once you're convinced of that, it's called faith, then you make this agreement with God, this commitment to God that I will begin the process of changing my life. And you're immersed into the kingdom. But the faith is small. And unless you and I commit to growing our faith through all these years that we have in the kingdom, we will never experience the abundant life that God planned for us. And we'll never be able to become all that God intended for us in our lives. And so we're on a journey that our faith might continue to grow. And I want to try to illustrate that this morning with an Old Testament story. It's a familiar Old Testament story. It's about a man named Gideon. Now, you may have a lot of favorite Old Testament characters. I have a lot of favorite Old Testament characters. Gideon is not my most favorite, but Gideon is a character whom I love to think about. And he is a powerful example for us in terms of growing our faith. The story of Gideon begins in Judges chapter 6. The descendants of Abraham have already completed their 40 years of wandering around in that ugly wilderness. And now a new generation of Israelites are led by Joshua across the Jordan River into what is called Canaan land, or that land that had been promised to Abraham's descendants. And under the leadership of Joshua, it's conquering time. They conquer cities, they conquer territories, they conquer people. But the years pass, and Joshua becomes old. And it happens to Joshua like it happens routinely to us. Joshua dies. And now the book of Judges begins. And it begins with these words, after the death of Joshua. And I've heard this all my life. I know it to be true that everyone is replaceable. And yes, you can always replace people. But it's not exactly right, because once in a while, someone comes along and they do such great service of leadership, or they make such an impact on our lives, that once they're gone, things are literally never the same again. And that's the way it is in the book of Judges. Things are never the same again after the death of Joshua. And those people begin immediately to forget about God. Isn't that strange? And as they forget about God, they begin to enter into all kinds of sins like the people around them are doing. And they even begin to worship the gods of all those Canaanite people. Predominantly, there are two. One is called Baal. Baal is the god of fertility. They think he brings the rain. He brings the abundant harvest. And there is an associated goddess named Asherah. And so everywhere you go across the land, you'll find these altars to Baal, and you'll find these poles that are called Asherah poles. And they're worshiping. They're building those things for themselves. And God does not bless the people. Now, you and I need to learn that when we actively reject God, having already known Him, having already been blessed by Him, when we actively reject God, and we start worshiping the things around us, God's not going to bless us. And you know what happens to those people without God? In their sinfulness, they get conquered by other Canaanite people. And those people of Canaan are delighting. You can almost feel it. They're so happy that they're conquering these Israelite people, and they oppress them unduly. Life is miserable. And such is the case as you begin Judges chapter 6. The Midianites, they have oppressed God's people. It goes on for 7 very long years. And it is such a difficult oppression that the people of Israel are leaving where they've been living, and they go up into the hills and they live in caves. And they live in strongholds that have been developed in the hills. And the reason is they're trying to hide from the Midianites. They don't want to lose their lives. And it gets worse than that. They'll try to grow some crops in that fertile Canaan land. And those grain crops will be growing and they'll be mature. And here come the Midianites. And the Midianites come with huge forces of men and soldiers. And sometimes they'll bring the Amalekites, and they'll bring other eastern people. And they'll come down, it seems, for the purpose none other than to just destroy the crops. And if they can find some cattle, if they can find some sheep, and they can find some donkeys, they kill them. They take them away. They leave these Israelites with nothing. They're starving. And the people then begin to cry out to God. Now, think about that. Why is it? Why is it that as people, we so often wait till things are totally desperate before we turn our attention back to God? And God sends a prophet to them. And the prophet says to these people, it's not my fault. It's not God's fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. Don't you remember how God took you out of Egypt? Don't you remember all the things that God has done for you throughout all this time? And now you know what you have done? You have started worshiping the false gods of these Canaanite people. Your oppression, this difficulty, it's not my fault, it's your fault. But now God does something so amazing. He sends an angel. Now, in the New Testament, and particularly the book of Romans, we talk often about the word grace. And one of the big giant headings of the New Testament is this word grace. But do you know that in the Old Testament, grace is found over and over and over again? These people in the day of Gideon deserve nothing. And yet when they cry out to God, God responds graciously. And he sends an angel. And if you're reading that story, you find the angel appears to a young man. We don't know how old he is. I kind of view it as kind of a teenage boy. Sends an angel to this person named Gideon. Gideon is a son of a man named Joash. If you read those verses in Judges chapter 6, here's the picture you see. Gideon is threshing grain in a wine press. Now, why would anybody thresh grain in a place where you ought to be dealing with grapes? And the reason is he's hiding. He's trying to protect the grain. Because if the Midianites find out he's got grain, they will come and they will take it away. They will destroy it. They'll do something so that these Israelites continue to be starving. It's at that point the angel speaks to Gideon. And the angel says to Gideon, "The Lord be with you, mighty warrior." Now, can you imagine how Gideon is feeling? The Lord be with you, mighty warrior. Where did the mighty warrior come from? I'm a farm boy, and I'm threshing grain here, and I'm trying to feed our clan, and yet here's a principle that I want you to see. When God sees us, he sees us as how we can be, not as how we are. We see ourselves how we are, and sometimes that's healthy. We admit our shortcomings and our failures and how much we need God. But sometimes we go too far with that and we think, I'm not good enough, I'm not able, can't accomplish this. And yet God sees all of us how he wants us to be. He sees us living in the likeness of Christ. He sees us differently than we see ourselves. And as Gideon hears these words, he turns to this angel and he begins to speak. Where has God been? Now he's respectful. Pardon me, sir, but where has God been? I've heard these stories. I've heard these stories from our forefathers about how God did this in Egypt and how God did that. Where has God been? And not only that, but why me? I am the least in my family or my clan. And my group is the least in all the tribes. Haven't we heard that before? Haven't we heard that over and over in the Old Testament? When God chooses someone, they'll look at God and say, I'm the least in my family. I'm the least among the tribes. Why me? And what I see in Gideon is a rare combination of boldness and humility. He's bold enough to ask God, where have you been? And God's already told them. He just hasn't heard it apparently. I've been right where I've always been. You're the one that walked away. And he's humble. Now, you can have boldness in this life without humility, and you become a monster. You become hard to live with. You become hard to work for. It's a miserable way to live. But if you'll tie humility to it, you have that wonderful, beautiful combination that God wants to use, because God only blesses and God only uses those who are humble. Never forget it. only blesses, only uses those who are humble. And Gideon says, I'm going to have a sign. You see, he doesn't believe anything. He has no faith. And without faith, God's not going to use you. I got to have a sign. And he says to the angel, would you stay right here? Would you stay right here? I'm going to go get some sacrifice material. I'll be right back. Stay right here. The angel stays. Gideon goes off, gets all the things, comes back and prepares this sacrifice. And before his very eyes, that angel reaches out and there's a fire that comes and it consumes everything. Can you imagine how Gideon is feeling? Can you see Gideon's eyes getting larger? Can you begin to feel how Gideon is saying, maybe this is real? Do you see his faith beginning to develop? Do you see his faith beginning to grow? But we're not near there yet. Gideon's got a huge task in front of him. Do you know what Gideon's going to be called to do in next week's lesson? He's going to be called to conquer these Midianites in the most strange of ways. He's not nearly ready for it yet. God's got to build him and grow him. And you know, don't you, that faith comes from hearing what God says? We're told that, by the way, in the New Testament. But faith also comes from experience. Faith also comes from experience. He's listening to the angel speak the words of God. But faith also comes from experience. He needs more experience. And so the angel says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to your own father's house. And I want you to tear down the Asherah pole. Now, as you read the story, you find out at his father's house, there's more than an Asherah pole. There's also an altar, an associated altar of Baal. To go to my own father's house and tear down those altars? But Gideon goes. Gideon goes. Only he takes 10 men with him. Young men, it says. 10 young men with him. And he goes at nighttime. He goes in the cloak of darkness. You know why he goes in the cloak of darkness? The scripture says he is afraid. He's afraid of his own family, and he's afraid of the men of the city. If they catch me doing this, I am a dead person. But though he goes at nighttime, he still goes. And he breaks apart those altars. He destroys it all. And the next morning, the men of the city find out, and they are what we would call fuming. They are angry, and they come, and they're demanding Gideon come out, and they're demanding that they kill Gideon. But the father Joash stands up to it. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and realize something. When you and I read a story in the Bible, so often we don't have all the story told to us. Is that shocking to you? We don't have all the backstory there. There had to be a backstory here for this to happen, what's about to happen. Because the father had to get up first and look out in his own yard and see those smashed to pieces altars, and he has to say, what in the world has happened? Gideon, what have you done? And Gideon probably explains, my father, you have to understand, an angel spoken to me. And Joash must believe that, because when these angry men from the city come and they say, bring Gideon out, we're going to kill him. Joash says, no, you're not. He said, I'll tell you what we'll do. It was Baal's altar that got broken. If Baal doesn't like it, let Baal deal with it. Let Baal kill my son. If he's really God, and we've broken down his altar, and my son broke down his altar, let Baal do it. And Gideon is saved by his own father's hand and his father's reasoning with these people. Can you feel Gideon getting stronger? Getting stronger? Can you feel him looking and thinking, God is going to use me? But we're not there yet. So now the Lord speaks, it says. Angel is gone. Angel left after the sacrifice. The Lord speaks and says, now Gideon, call all the people together, all the soldiers, all the fighting men, call them together because we're going to go fight the Midianites. Oh. It's one thing to turn on an altar in my dad's backyard. But to fight the Midianites? I've seen them when they've come to the crops and they bring so many camels and they bring so many men and fight the Midianites? And you can almost feel him in all that hesitation. It's hard to believe, but it's been 17 years since I went skydiving. It wasn't my idea, okay? It was Greg's idea. His mother had turned 80. So she was going to go skydiving at the age of 80, and Greg was going to go, and Susan was going to go, and Zonell was going to go. And we all went to this little, what I call rickety airport over in Hinton, Oklahoma. And somehow others of us got talked into it. As long as I have my mind, I'll not forget this experience. They took me up an extra 1,000 feet because they were going to video it and show it to chapel at Lubbock Christian, which they did. I was the poorest performer of the day by far. 10,000 feet. Thankfully, this guy's tied to my back from Tinker Air Force Base. Plane has no door on it. They inch you out so that your feet are dangling out the door. And you look down, and I can just see little specks on the ground. And I'm thinking, how can I get out of this? What in the world do I do? And the only way out is forward. It's interesting to me, that's how God does us in life. You remember a long time ago back at the Red Sea, the Israelite people? They look back, and here comes Pharaoh and all of his soldiers, and they don't look happy. In fact, they look angry. And here's this Red Sea, and we're going to be killed. And Moses is saying to God, what do we do? And God says, the only way out of this is go forward. Go forward. The only way out for Gideon is to go forward. But he's uneasy about it. And that's where the most famous part of Gideon's story comes. And you'll remember this passage that Burke's about to put on the screen, because Gideon says, oh, if you're going to save Israel by my hand, as you promised, here's my idea. I got this skin from a sheep. I'm going to lay it out here on the threshing floor. And if in the morning that sheepskin is wet from the dew and the ground is dry, then I'll know. Well, the next morning, guess what? The ground is all dry, but that sheepskin, he wrings out a bowl full of water. He's ready to go, isn't he? No. His feet are still hanging out the plane, and he's still looking down. And he says, oh, don't be angry with me. No, don't get upset. Could we do it one more time? Could we just reverse it? What if the ground is dry and the ground is wet and the fleece is dry? What if we do it that way? Do you see how patient God is? Isn't God a wonderful God? Isn't it amazing how he loves us and how he's willing for us to grow? Some people have the view that God is so mean and so hard, and he's looking for things to find against us, and God's taking this young man and building this young man and growing this young man. And can't you picture this? God in heaven looking down at Gideon, the second request about this fleece. Can't you see a big smile coming across God's face? Can't you see God looking at Jesus and saying, look at that? You know, just a happy smile. And now, Gideon's ready. And what you're going to find next week is going to take more faith then maybe I just wonder if I have that much faith. It's an amazing story for next week. But I'm going to tell you something again. Unless our faith continues to grow, if you're going to be the one that just gets baptized and say, it's all good and I'm done, you're right, you're done. You're not going to find the abundant life. You're not going to grow in the likeness of Jesus. You're not going to change this world. You're not going to be able to be used by God as God has intended to use you. It is a constant growth journey in this thing called faith. Now we're going to pause and take our Lord's Supper. Do you realize taking the Lord's Supper is an act of faith? That's what it is. We do it because we believe. We do it because we're convinced that God did send his Son. I'm telling you, if he didn't send his Son, you should be playing golf this morning. You shouldn't be here listening to someone like me. God sent his Son. And he raised him from the dead so that we could be covered with his righteousness. I guess it was about 10 and a half years ago that we experienced as a nation one of the worst terror attacks, or the worst terror attack on our own soil here on the mainland we've ever known. One of the planes that was destined to, I think, go to the Pentagon and be crashed, or maybe the White House, I guess it was traveling over Pennsylvania. Some men in that plane decided to take matters in their own hands. They were able to make the plane crash. The cry the man made was, "Let's roll. Let's roll." Our cry as Christians is, let's grow. We have to grow in the likeness of Jesus. Keep growing and see what God has in mind for us. We close with a song. By tradition, we call it a song of invitation. It's open for anyone. Remember, it's a baby faith that gets you into the kingdom. It's a growing faith that allows God to use you.